I would like to introduce Miles Buckhurst. He's from Jotun. He's coming in from Norway, but his accent says otherwise, which is going to inflict upon us very soon. Miles Buckhurst is a global concept director at Jotun, looking after hydrocarbon processing industry. Miles has 26 years of experience within the industry, starting life as a polymer and paint chemist, further working in various technical roles before taking on coating supplied in the HPI business area. So please, can you help me in welcoming Miles?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure, as always, to be back here. My first experience last year certainly told me that I had to come back, so it's good to be back here. I've chosen, actually, this is the wrong presentation. That's very interesting. That's the one I'm doing later on this morning. Is there any chance to find the Plenary presentation? Anyway, whilst they're trying to sort out the technical issues, I chose to talk about the philosophy of life cycle costs. And the Senator, he mentioned earlier the challenge of doing the job right. CapEx was mentioned. Money is part of what we work with. It's hard to avoid. In this conference, there's a lot of technical papers, a lot of technical discussions, and it's really interesting. But if no one's willing to pay for it, we have a problem. And so what I want to talk about in a moment, hopefully, is about how to get the right way of thinking to enable us to have the correct amount of money to do the job. I do have it on my stick. There we go. It's under ACA 2015 in the file, and then it's the life cycle cost. Okay, good. Always worth having your presentation on a stick as well when you're traveling around. So it's all about trying to find out where to get the money. Now, I called it a philosophy, and it's an odd word to use in this sort of venue, isn't it? But for me, it's a way of thinking. It's trying to get my clients, I mean, obviously I work for a paint company, so we have a very special and unique perspective on corrosion. We quite like it. We quite like it because it means somebody has to buy our product. But at the end of the day, we also need people to see the very big picture and the total aspect of doing corrosion protection and getting long life. For me, if we have corrosion, and somebody later on needs to paint it, that's good news. And if it only lasts 5 years and they need to paint it again, that's probably more good news for my budget. But the one good thing about working for paint is that there's always something to paint. So what we really want, people who care about their job and want to do a good job, is that we get a good long life out of our coating system and get to do it properly and get some pride out of the job. And sure enough, there'll be budget for doing some more painting later. The guys did a good job. They found my presentation. Excellent. So getting the correct perspective. Now, I don't want to teach you how to suck eggs. By the way, if you Google grandmother sucking eggs, just don't do it. That was the nicest picture I could find. You probably... Dean, control yourself. Probably... You all know what I'm going to tell you. I hope you all know what I'm going to tell you. But what I'd like to do is raise the level so we have it in the back of our minds always in everything we do when it comes to corrosion protection. Because I've spent the last quarter of a century, 25, bloody hell, hitting my head against the wall like this poor chap, trying to get people to understand all the different aspects that need to be controlled in order that we get good corrosion protection, and then we get a good long life out of what we're doing. And I would like to stop having to hit my head against the wall, talking about it time and time again, and people just saying, yeah, how much does it cost? Because the cost is ultimately not that much. It's literally just a drop in the ocean. Paint, cathodic protection, all these ways of stopping corrosion is very small cost comparative to the consequences of corrosion, or even the whole project itself. If we take some figures, in fact, I'm being a little bit luxurious here by saying that in a new construction situation, in oil and gas sector, that we use about 1% of the total project cost on paint. In fact, it's probably 0.75% in most cases. 1% would be doing the job really well. If we look at doing the painting process in new construction, it's probably 2.5% of the total project cost. So just the using of the paint is in fact much more expensive than the coating system itself. And again, you're all sitting there thinking, oh, but he works for a paint company, he wants to sell more expensive paint. And for certain, my boss would like me to do that. But there are more consequences here, which I'm going to talk about throughout this presentation. The sheer cost of building a gas plant or an oil refinery or chemical plants is enormous. So the money isn't small, even for the paint itself. We talk about millions of dollars in various different aspects. So it is consequential to the financial guys that are running a lot of the companies that we work with. And some of you guys work for oil companies. We all work to a budget. We have to work within certain constraints. The question is how we can turn a CapEx thinking into OpEx reality. Because if some of you guys work with existing operations and existing plant, you are frustrated by the sheer cost, enormous cost, of doing maintenance in coating systems. So let's have a little look about the actual nuts and bolts related to life cycle cost analysis. And, you know, we've got to look at all the different costs involved. And the more detailed you do it, the better it will be. So look at that structure there. You can see very quickly what is costing money here. And that's putting up staging, scaffolding. It costs a fortune both to rent it, to put it up, to bring it down again. So just something as simple as that can cost several thousand US every single day in the rent. So there's your first cost starting up. So we've got to take all of these different things into account in order to work out the life cycle cost. So add in all these things: the painting itself, the startup cost, scaffolding, cleaning, blasting, waste disposal. Waste disposal is becoming more and more expensive. It's almost as expensive, if you fill up a can of paint with the waste, it's as expensive to dispose of it as buying the paint is. So you need to put all these facts together, build them up, and I think here we have a traditional life cycle cost estimator. I think the first time I made one of these was probably 25 years ago when I first started working in my current company, and it hasn't changed a whole lot. It's still a spreadsheet. You put in the numbers, and out at the bottom line, it divides it by the number of years you expect it to last, and away you go. And as much detail as you can get into that is good. You have to understand all the different aspects of that costing process in order to do it. And to be honest, it's not very exciting, is it? So a lot of the time, the details are skipped over. And that's fine in some ways, but the more detail, the more understanding you have, as a philosophy, it's better. And we have some guidelines how to calculate lifetimes, because how long should a paint last? This is one of my great frustrations, I have to say, working with these sorts of standards. You may know the ISO standards, you for sure know your Australian standards. What I've put up there are the ISO standards in terms of exposure. The problem is that exposure is one simple aspect, and reading this little paragraph and describing that exposure is too simplistic. And then you have to put into it the lifetime you expect it to last. How long shall that coating system last? According to ISO 12944, you're given some paint thickness guidelines, some technology guidelines, and then you're given some test criteria. The trouble with testing is that it is short term. It's just a few hours, 480 hours, 720 hours, or maybe even if you're lucky, it's 6 months worth. But 6 months is far too short an amount of time to give you a true indicator of lifetime in reality. What we get is an indicator. And because we know, let's be honest, it's mostly epoxy coatings that are being used, we've known epoxies since the 40s. So we can have a correlation between real life and the testing. The problem comes is that you change things when you add certain pigments, and you affect the result which may not necessarily relate exactly to real-life situation comparative to that testing. So you have to look at testing as a very interesting and useful guideline, but not as a hard and fast rule or a law, because it's only going to take you so far. So already, we've gone very much into detail over the cost of things that you know. You know how much your scaffolding is going to cost. You know how much that blasting is going to cost. You've been given quotes for all those things. But you don't know good enough your lifetime. And if we take 12944 as it is today, it talks about lifetimes. Your first lifetime is the short one. That is 3 to 5 years. That's not too bad. That gives you a reasonably accurate time period. Then the second lifetime they talk about is 5 to 15 years. My God. Do you want 5 or do you want 15? 5 to 15 is a very broad time span. And quite frankly, in a commercial world, everybody who is going to write a specification for that writes it for the 5 years. And therefore, you've got a lot of maintenance to keep it up to the 15 years. And the final one, as it stands today, as I say, 1294 is being updated at the moment, but the final one is the one that we all use, and that's 15 years plus. So the question I have for you is, do you want it to last 15 years, or 25 years, or 40 years, or beyond? 15 years plus doesn't mean a great deal in the reality, because again, we'll spec it for 15 years to the best of our knowledge in order to be commercially viable in a bid situation. And this is a horrific situation for an owner, for an operator, because you'll put down a specification, you'll say, I want it to last 15 years, plus, say, maybe 25 years, but when it gets down to the yard or the contractor or the applicator, they're going to drag it right back to the absolute minimum they can get away with, because that's the game, that's the commercial game. Which is why I talk about it as being a philosophy, because all those calculations, they haven't yet taken into account anything more than the cost of the actual job itself. But if you are doing maintenance on a plant early because of corrosion, because the coating system hasn't lasted as long as you would wish it to do so, then it's your out of service, out of operation costs that are really going to kill you. So all this time, we've put together a very nice little computer program to calculate all these different costs, and then suddenly it's all negated by going out of service and having 500,000 to 2 million US dollars out of operation costs.